So guys, we're live and I'm gonna leave soon. Ciao.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Am I early or late?
Sorry?
Am I early or late?
Early. Don't worry.
Early, yeah.
Yeah.
Really? Because it's my first time. It's my first time to
Okay, nice.
join a seminar. Yeah.
Welcome then.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, can I join with two devices at the same time?
I never tried, to be honest, but it should probably work. Yeah, you just have
because
twice.
Because I'm on the iPad, so I cannot. I want to comment in the chat. I might have difficulty. So
Yeah,
if I try, so I want to enter with my phone as well.
It shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, I'll try. I don't know if it will work or not.
Normally it should work because you can connect a few times with the same link. So.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, it's working. So I have to disconnect the. Yep. It's working. So we are alone.
It looks like it, yeah. Just the two of us.
You know, I received another email about another seminar today. It said you have to be there 30 minutes before the seminar starts.
Oh no, usually that's just for the moderator and the teacher. 5 minutes, it's definitely enough in case for the next.
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, next time. Next time I'll try to be there before. Yep, 10 minutes remaining.
Yeah, Daniel should join soon.
Sorry, where are you from? If you don't mind me asking.
Sorry, what did you say?
Say, where are you from?
Oh, Switzerland.
Switzerland, yeah. What time is it now there?
It's 8.
8 a.m.?
8 p.m., yeah.
8 p.m. p.m.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's 9 p.m. here.
Where are you?
From Iraq.
Okay, it's 9.
Yeah, it's 9, yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Eric.
Hi.
Yeah, I recently sent Eric a friend request from Facebook.
Oh, did
Yeah,
I
that was-
accept it? Did I?
Yeah, you did.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I come like since I joined the news center, I completely lost track of most of my social media interactions, and yeah.
Yeah, understandable. Yeah.
But then I'm sitting on my balcony and the sun is shining right into my eyes now.
Yeah. What time is it?
What?
What time is it?
It's now 8 p.m. in Germany. But
8 p.m. and the sun is out. Really?
yeah, I mean it's summer. That's nice.
That seems so anachronistic to me. Yeah.
Where are you right now?
I'm from Iraq.
Okay.
Yeah.
How late is it there?
Yeah, it's 9 p.m., but it's completely dark.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
no, here it's basically like I don't
Yeah, it's
know.
amazing. You know, at
Yeah.
8 p.m. has to be dark. A priori.
The only truth we can agree on without any kind of dispute.
Yeah.
Eric, you look like you've been golfing. You look
No.
like a very sportive background.
No, I'm just sitting on my balcony because I want to, like, I have been in my room the entire day and basically the last couple of days entirely, and I wanted to enjoy some sun, some fresh air, some nice cold beer, and yeah, and enjoy Danielle's first session. Yeah.
Classic Eric, drinking in the class.
I ordered some pizza, so I'm gonna eat some pizza and later during the class.
You're like a real streamer.
But don't worry, I will turn the camera off when that's the case with the pizza.
Hold on. Fuck. Sorry. My webcam is being a.
Oh, here he is.
I know. Hold on. Hello, everybody. Give me
Hi.
a second.
Hi, Danielle.
Howdy. Wait, I need to fix. This is not the. I have a better camera, so I just need to fix this. Give me a second, please.
Sure.
I'm gonna be back.
Very interesting background.
Hi, Carl.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello, Carl.
Hi, and everyone else.
Hello.
Hi.
I wonder how many people from our accelerationist class are going to be in this one. Seems like quite a few.
What class was that?
It was Daniel's previous one.
Oh, the one on the CCRU and the
Yeah.
what's it called? Yeah.
I think you're muted, Daniel.
Here we go. Yay. All right, cool.
Hi.
1 second. Okay. I'm very potty mouthed this morning, so forgive me. Because I don't know who thought it was a good idea to start a seminar on a holiday weekend right after the 4th of July on a Sunday morning, but I guess we're all good.
If Kanye West can run for president, you can teach a seminar.
What?
Kanye West is running for president.
Is he really?
He announced it this morning. Yes.
It's amazing. It's amazing. All right, cool. I'm just setting up shop. I've been like trying to fix my Wi-Fi for an hour. I finally got it to work. So difficult morning, but I think we should be good.
Okay. Just a few technical things. Do you want us to take a break at some point, or?
Yeah. I'll.
Okay. I'll let you manage that, or?
Sorry.
You want me to find a time, or you want to?
No, I'll navigate it according to when I feel like we need a break.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I'll start the recording and then introduce the class, and we can begin.
Cool. Just give me. Yeah, well, I'm ready.
Let me know.
You are.
You are? Okay, perfect. So I'm starting this. So hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of the seminar Analytics and Continentals, Historical Fragment of a War, led by Daniel Sacilotto. This seminar will explore the bifurcation between the analytic and continental philosophical traditions since its inception, focusing on some of the central debates, methodological approaches, and canonical figures that animate its historical unfolding. Above all, we should clarify how different conceptions of what constitutes philosophical practice become progressively forged throughout this historical split, by identifying key moments and themes that define it and attending to periods of oftentimes frustrated exchange. After a brief excursus into the historical antecedents leading to the consolidation of the split, during the first session, we focus on the critique of psychologism prosecuted by Husserl and Frege, in which central methodological tenets in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language become first crystallized. In the second session, we focus on how this incipient separation was also accentuated and mediated by divergent responses to the legacy of German idealism, exploring the response to British Hegelianism pursued by Moore and Russell, as well as the development and growth of phenomenology from the neo-Kantian tradition with Husserl and Frege. As we shall see, if phenomenological thinking radicalized the transcendental Kantian approach, and semantic analysis understood to have begun already with Kant. In the third session, we explore how the logical empiricist and historicist hermeneutic orientation of thought propose two competing narratives concerning the end of metaphysics. One in the name of a ruthless positivism aligned to the modern ideal of scientificity, the other in the name of a comprehensive critique of modernity and the conception of philosophy as a science derived from its Greek beginning. In the fourth session, we revisit the debate between Searle and Derrida during the mid-70s, which emerged in response to G.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, and in which the constitutive aspiration of speech act theory and the deconstruction of metaphysics of present give way to not only different conception of language, communication, but also intentionality. In parallel, we attend to the debate between Chomsky and Foucault in 1971, concerning the question of human nature, where the aspiration of generating linguistic and the archaeology of knowledge reflects two conceptions of ethico-political practice, a universalist avowal of invariant human values and the need for concrete engagement on the side of the former, versus a genealogical approach which tracks the dynamic of power with skepticism regarding the naturalization of the concept of human nature and the danger of concrete engagement. In the fifth session, we explore how different strands of Celeria's school propose to rehabilitate the legacy of German idealism in the wake of a new naturalist and functionalist approaches to the philosophy of mind. Looking at works by J. Rosenberg, Richard Rorty, John MacDonald, Rebecca Kukla, Mark Lenz, and Sebastian Rodel, we will see how this tradition attempts not only an approximation to several canonical figures commonly associated with the continental tradition, but also thought of an integral philosophical practice which would include the concern of both traditions. Extended on this trajectory, in the sixth session, we look at the contrast in contemporary approaches to Hegelian scholarship and the valences of the dialectical method today. The Pittsburgh Hegelian school on the side of analytic tradition, and the Lacanian Slovenian school on the side of the continental tradition. In the seventh session, we delve into contemporary ontologies of world building and systematic philosophy in both traditions, contrasting the model realist metaphysics proposed by Nelson Goodman in Of Mind and Other Matters to the transcendental phenomenology of words proposed by Alain Badiou in Logic of Words. Finally, in the eighth session, we briefly survey some prominent contemporary attempts to destratify the difference between the continental and analytical school together, bringing an holistic approach that will synthesize the methods and insight of both traditions at once. We show how this contemporary approach challenging the myopia of specialization characteristic of the analytic tradition, while refusing the relativistic and skeptical tendency associated with much of the continental tradition, attending in particular to certain works by Fernando Zalamea, Lawrence Puntel, Ray Brazier, and Reza Negarestani. The seminar is taught by Daniel Sacilotto, who has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Los Angeles. His research focuses on the field of contemporary philosophy and Latin American literature. In particular, his research focusing on the reconciliation of rationalism and materialism and the methodological relation between epistemology and ontology in contemporary philosophy. He is currently finishing a full-length monograph tentatively titled Saving the Noumenon, an essay on the foundation of ontology, in which he proposes a critical reading of the ontological turn in contemporary philosophy and lays the foundation for a new transcendental epistemology, chiefly inspired in the work of Wilfrid Sellars, Robert Brandom, Alain Badiou, Lawrence Puntel, Ray Brazier, Reza Negarestani, and Jay Rosenberg. Now I will give the microphone to Daniel.
Thank you very much. That was a rehearsing of the syllabus. Now, just a few words before we get started. I have restructured a few things about the syllabus as from the description and the outlay of the course as described in that original description. So after a little bit, we will go through the syllabus in more detail, looking at the readings, and you'll get to see more closely how I've patched a few things up. The first thing to say, though, that's relevant for us immediately, and which I'll just say right now, is that the first session, i.e. today, we will not be devoting to the discussion as stated in the description of the critique of psychologism in Husserl and the Fregean context. I will make some mention, I will mention this in passing, but I have decided to leave this first session for a more broad sort of scope introduction. And that discussion will actually now be the topic for the second session alongside a few other things. So there's a slight restructuring of the course as such. Hopefully you guys got the chance to see the syllabus as it was updated into the class folder. I presume you all have access to that. Has anyone taken a look or a peek at the document so far? Just like give me a show of nods or hands or something. Cool. So you will already know slightly how I've restructured a few of the things, right? But we'll go over that in due course. So the game plan for today is basically, first of all, I'll ask everybody to introduce themselves and say who they are, typical introductory business. Then I'll say a few things about myself and how it is that this sort of course came about. Unlike other seminars that I have taught for the New Center, I will begin by giving a slight autobiographical sketch not in the sense of anything that's irrelevant, but I find that my philosophical formation and education is the reason why I have been led to think about this topic in a more sort of sustained fashion. And I want to just give you a slight insight into how it is that I first came into this topic, sort of to the attempt to think of this topic in a more systematic way. And after that, after I've given this kind of autobiographical sketch of how we arrive at the course, then I will begin to sort of introduce the course in a more systematic fashion by giving a broad brush introduction to the topic. And after that, what we will do is probably we'll take a short break or something just to decant. And, of course, you can at any point along the way jump in and, ask questions or anything that needs clarification. But then we'll look over the syllabus just to take a closer look at the readings ahead of us and the topics. And we will wrap up then at the end by sort of talking about coursework, logistics, and the boring business that is, of course, necessary for all of us to take care of. Okay. So does that seem amenable to everybody? Right. So to get us started, I suppose we can begin by the introduction. So everybody just can sort of move. Let's start with Ekin.
Hi, I'm Ekin. I have taken previous course with Daniel, and I think that this is one of the more interesting topics in terms of my own research interests. I'm a graduate student at CUNY Graduate Center's philosophy program, and yeah, an interest in synthetic approaches to philosophy writ large.
Awesome. Evrim? And if I mispronounce your name, please.
Yeah, my name is Evrim. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, this is, I'm in the critical philosophy program at the New Center, and this is my the fifth seminar I'm taking. Yeah, I watched some of the previous CCRU seminars, but I didn't attend it as a student. Yeah, that's all.
And also, can you guys just point out where are you based, just for for me?
I live in Istanbul, Turkey.
Awesome. Eric, I'm just going by panel order, by the way.
Okay. Hi, I'm Eric. I live in Germany, and I study sociology and philosophy. I'm still a bachelor student, but the topic and the conflict between analytic and continental philosophy basically has been with me since my second semester, I think. And at some point, I just stopped thinking about it, to be honest, but I'm more and more coming to the point where I need to think about it again. And so I have some background in postmodernism, post-structuralism, a little bit in analytic tradition, but also a lot in like the political thought that came out of like post-structuralism, postmodernism, and have been getting into accelerationism and tipped my toes into neo-rationalism, and I'm really, really excited for this. And yeah, hope to see what's coming.
Kian Bergstrom.
Hello, I'm Kian. I am based in Chicago, Illinois. I'm also like Evrim in the critical philosophy track, and very interested in the intersections amongst the different strands of mid-20th century philosophy as they intertwine and unbraid over the course of the decades. This is the first seminar that I'm taking at the New Center.
Welcome. Carl Olsen.
Yes, hi. My name is Carl. I'm a PhD student at Newcastle University, although I'm currently in Sweden because of, well, circumstances in the world. And I'm trying to sort of make some, so I'm in geography, and I'm trying to make some kind of connections between geography and parts of the analytic tradition, and think about that a bit. So that's why I'm here. Thanks.
Dilshad?
Yep. Hello, everyone. My name is Dilshad. I'm from Iraq. I'm a medical doctor. I have had no formal training in philosophy whatsoever, so I'm an autodidact, what you might call a philosophical nomad, who scavenges through various philosophical schools. For a long time, I have been interested in Sellars and Sellars-inspired philosophers, especially Robert Brandom. And because of my recent interest in philosophy of medicine and bioethics, I think various Sallarsian ideas like his space of reasons thesis, his normativity, his pragmatism, his the bifurcation between the scientific image and the manifest image can be deployed within the framework of philosophy of medicine and bioethics. That's what I'm currently working on. And because recently I have stumbled upon the new schools from continental philosophy, like new rationalism, speculative realism. I'm really interested in those schools because I know that Daniel is heavily involved with these schools. I want to learn more. What I hope to achieve throughout these seminars is that I really want to have a conception of philosophy that is not constrained by some sort of a priori metaphilosophical constraint that presupposes the division between analytic and continental philosophy. So I want to reach a product in philosophical thinking that is pluralistic, eclectic, synthetic, that gains ideas from both sides, basically. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And where are you based?
From Iraq.
Awesome. Bertrand? Bertrand? Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, hi. Sorry, sometimes I don't get the sound for a few seconds. So hi, my name is Bertrand. I'm based around Lisbon, Portugal, and my interest in this course is I'm mostly interested in musicology, so no direct relation to philosophy, but yeah, I also have a very informal kind of background. I couldn't really say that that I know most of the stuff we're gonna go through, so I'm super excited. But yeah, I'm pretty much probably the least knowledgeable person around here. So, but you know, I'm also very interested in a lot of the topics we're gonna discuss. So, yeah.
Awesome. Levin?
Hi, friends. Yeah. Hello. I'm Levin. I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm doing my PhD in sociology from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And I'm working on climate change-induced migration in the context of the subcontinent. Apart from sociology and anthropology, I'm interested in contemporary continental philosophy. Thanks. It's a nice initiative. I really like the course syllabus. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Alan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alan. I'm from Mexico. I'm currently in the UK. Well, my background is in architecture and some critical theory, Continental. And well, my background in analytical philosophy is pretty much non-existent. So this is like a good opportunity, and Daniel's courses are always really good. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Hernan? Hernan? Well, I can introduce Hernan for everybody.
Daniel, sorry, I'm running. I'm driving. I'm running into a checkpoint for here in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Yes.
I yield my time for the moment. I will introduce myself further along if that's okay.
That's that's okay. Just yeah, you can introduce yourself later if you want.
Thank you. Sorry about this.
No worries. All good. So that's everyone I have on the panel before me. I don't know if there's more people in there. Aladdin, do you?
If you want, I can introduce myself. Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, my name is Aladdin. I have background in art and visual anthropology, and each in philosophy that I wanted to come through the new center. And yeah, that's basically that. I also don't have any proper background in philosophy.
Cool. And I presume is there anyone else that I'm not seeing in the right now? I'm just going by what I'm looking at before me.
Yeah, I think you called all the panelists as far as I can see as well.
All right. Well, if there's anybody else that just jumps in later in the discussion, I'll just probe them to introduce themselves as they jump in. Okay. So just a few words. So welcome everybody. I'm Daniel, obviously. I'll say a few more things about myself in a little bit, but just a few brief methodological preliminaries after everybody has introduced themselves. A lot of you have already taken prior seminars with myself, so you have a good idea of some of my sort of philosophical background and the kind of things that primarily drive my philosophical research. So for those of you who already have a philosophical background and who know my own research in advance, I ask a little bit of patience, specifically for those who do not have a philosophical background and who are for the first time taking a seminar. We might have to revisit some things that, at certain points that might seem, introductory or of that ilk, but that's the nature, as you know, of having a, multidisciplinary sort of context such as ours. So I will try to always be navigating the sort of topic, both at a level in which non-specialists can address it, but also, hopefully at a level of sophistication as well that can actually, dig deep into the issues. So in this regard, by the same token, those of you with no philosophical training, if at some point, especially during this introductory session, or when you're doing the readings, any of the terminology or the topics or the talk sounds just, specialized, and so you need clarification with regards to what I'm talking about or what any of the other participants are talking about, do feel free to ask. It's not, this is the context where you're going to get, a clarification. Now, I try to be as pedagogical as possible with regards to terminology. So generally, when I bring a term that's a technical term that's used in the philosophical tradition, I'll try to say what it means. And I also make a very corny and ample use of PowerPoint, as those who have taken seminars with me know. And what I will be doing after each class is the PowerPoint relevant for the session will be uploaded into the class drive folder. So you'll be able to access that, and that will generally include slides that will go over the major points of discussion that we will have covered, or at least that I will have been going through. And of course, then you will be able to revisit the sessions as they are uploaded. Now, I believe we just got a new member into the group. Alisker. I don't know how you pronounce the name, but could you introduce yourself? Aliaskar, I believe. So the audio is connecting. So let's give it a brief second.
Hello.
Hello. Yep.
Hi, my name is Aliaskar. I live in London, and I come from art background, fine art background, and I'm auditing this class.
What background? I'm sorry, I think I missed that part.
Fine arts.
A fine arts background. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Great. That was the briefest introduction I've ever heard, but none the worse for it. Okay, great. So to get us started, any preliminary questions, anything anybody wants to just throw in, say something right off the bat, or we can just get started? We all good? All right, great. So let me just say a few things. I promised a brief autobiographical sketch for reasons of content, not just for indulgence. So I'm Daniel, of course. I'm a Peruvian philosopher, scholar, and I began my education in Peru at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, which is the Catholic university, but it's probably the most reputed philosophy university in Peru. Now, as many countries in Latin America, Peru is very much continental philosophy bent. And if you don't know even what continental philosophy really means, in fact, I'm not sure any of us do, but that we'll get to that in short notice. But I, of course, like most people, started studying philosophy just not knowing the first thing about this distinction or this divide. It just so happened that you are introduced into, a philosophical corpus of classical texts, but you're not told about this distinction until later, if at all. Sometimes instructors that do not believe in the distinction is real or important will not even go over that, and it will be something that you will have to pick up on by yourself. So different people I found come into contact with the distinction at different stages in their philosophical formation, assuming they have one. And the way that they are introduced into it can be very different. In my case, I began by taking a modern philosophy course, modern meaning in the technical sense of the modern period of 17th century until roughly the mid 20th century. And at the time, I had no idea about this divide. Then I took a contemporary, that's what the course was called, contemporary philosophy course at the university. And this is when I started to get a feel for there being two traditions. We read Husserl, Heidegger, a bunch of other texts corresponding to the so-called Continental tradition. And then we briefly took a look at a few of the quote-unquote analytic representatives, namely Wittgenstein, some texts by Quine, Rorty. But you can already perhaps tell, those of you who already know a little bit about these two traditions, that the curriculum was very much continental heavy and continental bent. And it wasn't only bent on continental by just sheer volume of texts corresponding to the tradition in the syllabi, but the methodology was quite different, was very specific. There was a big emphasis placed on history of philosophy. When we had to do coursework, the coursework revolved around basically doing summaries of the text, being able to rehearse the text. We had to study Greek and Latin at the university as a mandatory propedeutic sort of exercise to being philosophers. And there was no formation required in formal logic at all. We didn't have to take logic. You could become a PhD in philosophy without getting any kind of formation in symbolic logic or formal logic. So this was, of course, a very, very, continental bent program. The major schools of thought that predominated at the university, and not just in this particular university, but in Peru more generally, were phenomenology. There were some notable Husserlian scholars and Heideggerian scholars, some people doing critical theory, hermeneutics, based off Gadamer mostly. And we really didn't get very far into quote unquote really contemporary stuff, but there were some people doing work on Lacan, Deleuze, and Zizek was starting to peek into the public imaginary. But that was basically the major sort of a structure of, Gadamerians in Latin America. But so that was my story. Well, something happened to me during my second year of university when I finished my general studies education, which was, of course, I had taken courses at this point on ancient philosophy, read my Plato, read my Aristotle, some of the Hellenistic philosophers, and so on. And then all of a sudden, I was looking, as a curious guy that I was, online for just some materials on Plato. And I bumped into this article by a certain scholar by the name of Gail Fine, who taught at Cornell University. She was a scholar on Plato and ancient philosophy. And I remember I was at the time writing or trying to write a paper on Plato. I don't remember exactly what it was on. But I remember downloading this essay that was posted online by Gail Fine on Plato and the two worlds, reading of Plato. And I could not follow a sentence. It was so technical, peppered with formal logical symbolism that I could not read for the life of me. And it read very differently than anything that I had read during my undergraduate years so far, which had only been a couple years. But it was a very, very different, both in style and in content. The first thing that really stuck out to me as a young philosophy student was, of course, the presence of this highly formalized language in the attempt to read a ancient philosophical text. I had some notion of the history of formal logic and the importance of formal logic in philosophy at this point, of course. But what was completely anathema to my university formation was, for example, looking at Plato or Aristotle, through the lenses of this like highly technical, symbolic, logical apparatus. And yet here was the scholar treating ancient philosophy through these nifty tools, but I was in no position to understand any of it. I had been led to believe, actually, by my instructors that, formal logic and so on was kind of a nifty tool, but that, at the end of the day, when you are approaching a text such as, an ancient philosophical text, it would be sort of anachronistic to deploy these tools. You have to read it on its own terms. You need to read the Greek and the, Latin or the German or the French or whatever. But the application of these tools of logical analysis for the sort of survey of ancient courses or courses that do not correspond to it was not a widely held practice, at least not in my department. And from what I've surveyed, it has also been more generally not the experience of most people in my context. But this led me to believe that I was being indoctrinated in a way. I felt that there was something off, that the characterization of this other tradition, this analytic tradition, from the brief morsels that I got from it, was being perhaps misrepresented. And that the objections that were being waged against this tradition were strawmen. At the very least, I felt, well, if I have any shot at formulating a coherent objection, I should at the very least be able to understand what these people are saying. But I wasn't. I was not capable of understanding these texts. So what happened at the time is, well, my grades were very good at the university, and I thought, well, why not try my luck and try to go to study abroad, and maybe try to get into a good university. Well, long story short, I got into Cornell of all places, where lo and behold, my direct advisor ended up being Gail Fine, the same woman that wrote this essay on Plato that I was just mentioning to you. Now, she happens to be married also to Terence Irwin, another very prominent scholar of ancient philosophy. Both of them hold very they're emeritus professors at Cornell University. So I moved to Cornell University with my continental philosophical baggage information at this point. And of course, what I found myself was that within the first 2 weeks of taking seminars, I was already a junior technically at this point. I was simply out of my depth. I could not, even though I had been, sort of a standout student in my Peruvian university, in this context, I did not even have the basic chops, let's say, to participate in any of these discussions. And I was slightly not just intimidated, but this sent me into a kind of existential crisis of sorts, right? Because I felt all of a sudden that everything that I had been taught in a certain way was useless. And it was useless not only because the methodology was very different, but what was being asked of me as a prospective philosophy major and student was highly different. I was being asked no longer to write summaries of philosophical text. I was asked to engage in polemical, analytical arguments with the text. Essays would be something like, discuss the coherency of, I don't know, Socrates' disavowal of, knowledge, right? And in the Apology or something like that. And so this required me to do something that I had been taught not to do. There was a sense of textual reverential distance, at least at the stage of undergraduate formation, which basically told us in my Peruvian university, if you're engaging with a text such as Plato's or Aristotle's, don't presume you're in a position to even understand it, let alone disagree with it. So the conversation again was centered on more an attempt to understand the text on its own terms, trying to work our way around the linguistic and cultural differences that sort of separated us from the text. But here I was being asked directly to say what my agreements and disagreements were. Well, needless to say, this is a skill that, as any other skill, requires training. So at the very beginning, I was extremely disoriented and I was not effective at writing these papers. But I got the hang of it quickly enough. Now, as time went by, I came to, and of course I was, the coursework that I was taking now centered highly on analytic philosophers. So I got Introduction to Analytic Philosophy that was very different than the Introduction to Analytic Philosophy that I had been given. Because of course I mentioned to you, we read what, Wittgenstein, Rorty, maybe a little bit of Davidson here and there. But for example, we had never read Moore or Russell in any seriousness, or Carnap in any seriousness, or we had never read the Salarsian School to any seriousness, or Putnam, or many of the names that are sort of bona fide analytic philosophical formation, must reads, as it were, for any person that gets a degree. Well, I was introduced to all these traditions and I realized I was right. I was being indoctrinated. What I was told the analytic school was a caricature. However, the same applied conversely. The way that continental philosophy was being characterized by most of my professors and the way that these topics were touched upon did not correspond whatsoever to the degree of seriousness of the methodologies and the topics that were being dealt with back home, back in Peru. Heidegger was often treated as a kind of ruin, the big ruiner of 20th century philosophy. Hegel was nonsense. Nobody could understand what Hegel says, and those who claim they're bullshitting themselves. I have my doubts. But, yes, you would read, maybe some things about the Frankfurt School here and there, but forget about Lacan, Zizek, all of that stuff is basically out the window. You want to read that? Well, better luck in a comparative literature department or, in some other humanities department. But philosophy, really, when it came to dealing with the quote unquote continental tradition, really remained on the reels, let's say, the canonical figures that were sort of accepted and you had to teach because otherwise what else are you going to do? So we would read, I don't know, Hegel, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, if you can even call those people continental. I mean, you can say, and we'll talk about this, you can make the case that this is historically, it precedes the difference. But then Husserl, Heidegger, again, the Frankfurt School, maybe Gadamer, a few things here and there. That was it. What ended up happening was that I felt that I was now being indoctrinated in the opposite direction, right? I was being told that this body of work, which was called continental philosophy, was a bunch of gobbledygook at its worst, and at its best, it had some things of worth here and there. But then there were these huge tracts of the tradition that I was already familiar with that were being just simply thrown out the window. And furthermore, I felt that there was this kind of glaring neglect for the history of philosophy and interest in the kind of linguistic or cultural, if you want to call it that, attention to the text that we were reading. So it was very easy for people to talk about Plato's arguments without really wondering or worrying too much about how to understand the Platonic concepts, right? What does eudaimonia really mean? How do we approach a Greek translation or text? Topics that people who go to continental schools are very much from the get-go introduced to, the sense of respect for historical distance and discursive difference. Well, this was generally missing from my education at Cornell. And what ended up happening was I ended up writing a thesis on Husserl and Heidegger in Cornell, which was completely, sacrilegious. It wasn't really fit to the department. I ended up working with Gail Fine as my advisor, and she was sort of, okay, I mean, you can do whatever you want, I guess. I don't really know very much about this, but so I ended up writing this thesis, which was, retrospectively, I still have it somewhere hidden in my hard drive, but it's a disaster. They gave me my honors, and they said, "Get the hell out of here. We don't want to know anything about you, you weird Peruvian." But after this, I was kind of left in limbo, right? I had these, and this is a first sort of lesson, I guess, that we can begin to think is many people, and I encounter both in Peru and at Cornell, would say that the distinction is really non-existent. You don't need to worry about this. But at every level that you can divide the discipline, methodology, style, curriculum organization, the work that's demanded of the students, what is expected of them, the idea of what a philosopher is, what they should do, how they should actually approach their work, was extremely different from the get-go. Now, I understand, of course, I'm extrapolating on the basis of my own experience, but this personal experience left a mark, which meant I already knew I wanted to be a philosopher. But by the end of my undergraduate education, I did no longer know what this meant. I understood that there was this deep institutional divide in the discipline, and that this divide was not as innocent as I had thought maybe at the beginning. Like, oh, well, there's these two traditions, but if you're a philosopher, you become acquainted with both. In a certain sense, I had to make a choice, because the choice that you made concerning where you fall in the spectrum decides what schools you're going to go to, who you're going to work with, what kind of papers, what kind of text you're going to be writing, in what style, what things you need to focus on. If you're going to go into analytic philosophy and you don't know your baby logic, you're going to be out of luck, and you're not probably going to get a job anywhere. If you go to continental philosophy and you're not very well versed on the history of philosophy, you're probably going to have some trouble. But this is where I was, right, coming out of my undergraduate education. I spent a few years out on my own in the wild, working, paying back loans, reading philosophy voraciously on my own accord, both analytic and continental. I had developed a taste also for analytic clarity. It was sobering. After reading, maybe Derrida or Heidegger for a year, doing my thesis, reading, Quine from time to time can be a very sort of refreshing experience, and vice versa, right? But then I decided, well, now it's time for me to go back on the horse. I want to get back into, now it's time for me to do my graduate degree. What do I do? Where do I go? How do I approach this? And what I realized was that, well, studying philosophy, at least in the United States, is very difficult if you have a continental bent or you want to deal with continental authors. At the time, I was already knees deep into Badiou and Zizek and Lacan, and it was very hard to think of a philosophy department, even continental friendly or bent department, that would have those figures tied up to their curriculum. Of course, the first thing that came to mind was the New School, right? But I had to begin to think of alternatives, and comparative literature became the obvious thing, right? Comparative literature gives you a kind of, let's say, freedom to explore, continental authors, but also different disciplines. And I was at the time thinking to myself that I might not want to just become a specialist, in the sense that, if I went into a philosophy school for continental philosophy, I would end up writing, a dissertation on a philosopher, Heidegger or Badiou or whatever. But I wanted to write something a little bit broader in scope, and perhaps the way to go was comparative literature. So long story short, I ended up going to UCLA for my, comparative literature PhD program. And partially because I knew that the experimental critical theory module, which is a kind of sub-program that occurs here at UCLA, which I live next to, by the way, which is where I'm pointing to my left, to my right, sorry. Oh, to my left. Anyway, so they had Zizek and Badiou and Stigler and many other prominent people that I was reading at the time I'm very much interested in. But they also had a great philosophy department. Tyler Birch, David Kaplan work here. So I thought, hell, this is going to be great, because I'm going to be able to remain close to the philosophy department, but I'm going to be able to write in a more free manner and pick my topics as I see fit. So I got here, and that's what I basically thought of doing. I started taking my theory classes, and I would attend to seminars in the philosophy department where people started to see me more often than anybody that, was really not affiliated with the department, where I became known like a member of their own. So I was literally dividing myself into these two camps. And of course, the division that I mentioned that I experienced back at Cornell became extremely crystallized in the American academic context, in the division between how it is that the humanities appropriated continental philosophy and what philosophy departments were doing. Comparative literature was basically exclusively at the level of theoretical formation, continental embed, right? We read continental philosophy or theory, which is, very much anathema to anything analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy, the analytic philosophy department was very much the same as my Cornell experience, extremely close and similar. But here I understood one more thing, and this is another aspect that I think is going to that informed my urgency to deal with this topic again. And it's very interesting. I noticed that there was an asymmetry in the pedagogical modes, not just methodologically in the sense that I have already mentioned, but there was a very interesting difference and very ironic. In the seminars that I was taking at the ECT and at UCLA, where we were reading Lacan, Deleuze, Badiou, et cetera, there was again this sense of authorial devotion. In other words, it was considered to almost sacrilegious to call into question the authority of the authors that we were surveying, except perhaps to call into question how white, ethnocentric, phallogocentric they were from time to time. But in general, most of the time was spent trying to understand the texts themselves. And very little time was spent with polemics. When we had somebody come over as a guest speaker or something, it would again be listening to them speak for a few hours and then a Q&A where we would just probe further into their knowledge or trying to draw some interdisciplinary sort of links between the topics. And this was the norm throughout my entire graduate formation. In the analytic department, it was a very different context. The seminars were obviously ran by some professor or other, but what would usually happen was within 10 minutes of the poor professor talking, opening their mouths, a discussion would break because some undergraduate or some professor who would sit in the seminar would question something, would say, well, that doesn't work, or this doesn't follow, or this. And all of a sudden, it was very easy to get derailed, right, from the sort of the structure of the syllabi. We were always lagging behind. But there was this environment of debate, which was extremely democratic. Again, graduate students, undergrads, professors were all in the same room in this kind of spirit of just questioning. And there was no sense of authorial sort of gauntleting, keeping people back from speaking. It was very, very intense intellectually and very, no holds barred. Even when somebody like Balibar, who came, several times to UCLA and spoke in both the comparative literature department and in the philosophy department, when Balibar went to the philosophy department, he was crucified. He was, he was trying to speak for about, 30 minutes, and he couldn't get a paragraph out without somebody jumping in and telling him that his reading of Spinoza was all over the place. So there was a very different sort of formation in the classrooms, and needless to say, these departments did not communicate with each other. Tyler Birch, who is a prominent authority in the philosophy department, I remember him explicitly saying during one of the classes that, one of his seminars, yeah, those people doing, Continental whatever in the comparative literature department or whatnot, it's just all crackpot bullshit. Don't waste your time with that. And unfortunately, one of the things that did happen was whenever there was a sort of curious enough philosophy student that wanted to say, I don't know, get their Lacan or their Deleuze, and they stepped into the classroom of a comparative literature seminar, they were very, very quickly, they felt completely out of place. They felt like, wait, this is not how we discuss philosophy. This is not how we, do this stuff. And I don't think I ever met a single comparative literature student, unfortunately, that took my advice and said, you should probably just sit there and take a look for yourself how this works. Just not to run with some preconceived idea of what philosophy is. Just see how they carry about their business. The reason why this is ironic is that continental philosophy often prides itself in being hypercritical, attentive to historical conditions, attentive to dogmatism, very much critical of these kind of like undetected, sedimented roots of tradition that have laid unquestioned for ages. But in my experience, there was a sense of authorial devotion in the manner that these courses and these materials were dealt with during the class. Conversely, the caricature of the sort of analytic philosopher as this kind of lab rat that sort of operates in this very narrow-minded, dogmatic, robotic manner, but doesn't really question their underlying presuppositions, was out of place. My experience was, no, these people were really concerned with like open debate and so on. So again, I was pulled at both ends of my mind, and I started reading Sellers, now in a comparative literature department, so doing like heavily Continental influence work. And this led me down a rabbit hole where I was now literally completely disenfranchised by my discipline, and I had no place in academia, in the academic structuring, because my work was doing a weird mixture of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and then dealing with Latin America on the one hand. And of course, this had no business, no place in the philosophy department, but it was too abstract and too philosophically bent for what I was doing in the comparative literature department. So, it was one of these situations in which I just simply could not find a way, into the kind of work that I wanted to do while being represented. Now, that's what I'm going to say. I mean, that's all I want to say about as far as like autobiographical background goes. But as a result of this experience, this, as you can tell, probably tortuous experience, I, at different points during this journey, wrote a few texts about this analytic continental divide. The first one I published in my blog, which ran roughly during my time from a couple of years before I started grad school until 2000 and I want to say 15, 16. I don't write there anymore. But it is a short text that I wrote actually in response to Levi Bryant, who some of you might know. He's also taught at the New Center, who runs the blog Larval Subjects, which is a reference, of course, to Deleuze. He's a Deleuze scholar, but also many things. He's a great philosopher in his own right. But anyway, he wrote this piece a long time ago. This was in the year 2012. So I was in my second year of grad school at the time, about the continental analytic divide. You can probably dig it in his blog. And I wrote a response piece, not just a response to Levi, but also detailing my own experience as a Peruvian student migrating to the US, a different academic standard, and sort of shuttling back and forth between continental and analytic philosophy, not just within philosophy departments, but comparative literature. So I've extracted that text, that post. It's still there, but I have it with me, and I'll send it to you guys. I'll upload it to the thing so you can take a look over this, because I go through some of the points that I've just like sort of rehearsed very briefly, and some of the deeper impressions that I got out of my experience. I don't want to like get into that too deeply right now, because obviously it's more of a retrospective on my own impressions, as opposed to something that we are right now in a position to assess. And then I later, actually for the New Center Journal, wrote a small piece called A Salarsian Look at the Analytic Continental Divide. This was, I believe, a couple years ago, which was published online just in the, I don't know how you pronounce it, but the and journal, I guess.
Triple ampersand.
There you go. So you can take a look at that as well. That's obviously online in that journal. It's more really of it's a piece more on Sellers than on this divide, but there I touch upon some of these topics in a more systematic fashion coming from the Salarsian tradition. So that's roughly, this has been a topic that's always been in my mind. And the one thing that I can tell you right now from the get-go is that anybody who wants to underplay the significance of the distinction and just brush it aside as a sociological distinction or something that really doesn't matter because you should be reading both things, that is really disingenuous at the very least, right? And anybody who is actually been trained in philosophy and has been exposed to both, sort of traditions and the very academic structuring of the discipline is highly sensitive to this distinction. And again, it's not just sociological in the sense of an academic or professional distinction, but it runs deep into the methodologies, the topics, what you read, what you don't read, how you write, what you're expected to do, and so on and so forth. So that's my broad brush sort of autobiographical narrative. Let me stop there for 1 second, because I've been speaking for like 20 minutes straight. So just like any thoughts or any, because I've been reading, like just peeking at the webinar chat, and I know that some people have had some experience at the university or otherwise with this. Anybody wants to just say something about this?
Very relatable. It is
Relatable. Yeah.
It's such an, I mean, I think many of us sort of are attracted to, because I feel like in my undergrad as an analytic philosophy at an analytic philosophy department, there'd occasionally be a professor who would say there's this one lineage and there's this other lineage, and then you could cross the chalkboard out and say, but I don't think about this division as very critical. It's all philosophy. And I hear this repeated pretty often amongst people who are sympathetic maybe to both traditions, but really steeped in one tradition over the other. And it seems like, while that's a better attitude than perhaps the dogmatism, that also underplays something that's a bit critical, which is, I mean, I felt the same exact way that you felt when I first started reading Foucault or Deleuze or Derrida, and had been, trained basically in logic, philosophy of mind, the way like Ned Block or someone writes, which is just not hermeneutic at all. And it was very poetic, obviously, so there was something grasping, but it feels like if we just cross out the board and undo this distinction, then there's also this lacuna as to, well, why can't I grasp this if it's all philosophy?
Right. By the way, I think we have a Regis. I don't know how you pronounce it. Yes.
Yeah, Regis. Okay.
Regis. Okay. Sorry. Can you introduce yourself just briefly?
Okay. No, you have already presented yourselves. Okay.
Yes, we did.
So, okay. Sorry, I was a little bit late, but because for me everything was relatable. I'm finishing my my master's dissertation in University of São Paulo in Brazil, and I'm studying Hegel and philosophy department in São Paulo. As I said in the chat box, it's a very continental department, but there are some professors that are more analytic oriented, but the divide is very strict. So, and my supervisor is very, very, very continental. He studied Lacan, Adorno, and Hegel, but he tries to approach analytic philosophy just to criticize, but he doesn't read well the analytic philosophers, and I started to read. I wanted to read, have a better reading of analytic philosophers, because my professors they didn't they don't have a good reading of analytic philosophy. So as I study Hegel, and Hegel is now is his there are much of analytical readings like from Brandon and McDowell and the Sillardian readings of Hegel. So I just went to read Sellers, and for the past months since last year, I'm really reading Sellers for real, to have a good reading of Brandon's reading of Hegel and everything. So it's been very, very good. I'm really liking Sellers, and I'm going to read your text, Sacilotto, and there are a group of students from New Center, and we are going to translate some of the articles from 1% to Portuguese, and probably I think I'm going to translate your text. So we are publishing here probably this year yet. We don't know where, but we are going to publish some of this text. And I was very interested on the theme of Sellars and look on the divide, analytic and continental, and I'm reading Sellars, and I'm very excited with this seminar, just because I just started to read Sellars for sake of Brandon McDowell, and I'm really liking Sellars, and I want to have a good reading of the Kantian strand, this type of Kantian philosophy Sellars is doing, and for now this is my interest here. But I want to end in a like a Hegelian reading of Sellars, and with a specific take on this divide. Okay, that's it.
Cool, thank you. I think Hernan just joined us finally, and good timing since we're completing the introductions. Hernan, are you good now?
I'm good. I apologize.
No, no worries, no worries.
I just came back from an asado, and wine was had, and I had to run to a checkpoint just when you were introducing me. So I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's my bad. So yeah, I'm Hernan Blumenthal. I'm based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. My formal training is in biochemistry, natural sciences, biotechnology, etc. I lost interest pretty quickly. I wasn't into a lab work at all. Having to do or follow protocols, not thinking what I was doing was a very not really reflecting on the methods and techniques and the measuring instruments and the epistemic tools we were using was killing me. So I started questioning myself about what the hell science was. And well, one thing, yeah, led to another, and I went to the Universidad of Buenos Aires, which I didn't mention. And I did a postgraduate program it was in like an overview of ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary philosophy, very, very superficial, but that was it for me. I knew I was hooked. Obviously very, very much continental. So I related to Daniel's story very much. Yeah, I was out of my depth. Absolutely. It was very hard to get into. One of the professors was working on the science of logic of Hegel, and I didn't know like what was going on. So
I still don't though. So.
No. I mean, I think I'm since Andrei Chitu's seminar. I think I'm starting to grasp a little bit more what Hegel was trying to convey, but not by a long shot. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. So I'm actually right now interested in I'm writing a research proposal, and I'm interested in how distinct theoretical domains inform and constrain each other synchronically and diachronically in the mind and brain sciences. So I'm thinking of going back to school or research actually. So yeah, that's me. We'll end it there. Sorry.
Awesome. And just to speak to a few of the things that were said right there, I mean, I think I already conveyed this point, but it's that there is a tendency to caricature the other tradition very strongly, depending on where you're standing, which is particularly ironic when you know, especially in a continental department, which again prides itself of being particularly acute as a tradition that reads history, takes it seriously, looks at texts in their own rights. But when it comes to dealing with the analytic tradition, it's very strawman-y. You know, I remember again back to the Peru days that I was led to believe that basically, you know, there was this thing called logical positivism, which defined the birth of analytic philosophy. The early Wittgenstein was the apotheosis of the analytic project of semantic analysis as it was born. Then Wittgenstein realizes he was being stupid, and he becomes Heidegger, you know, and then he shoots down his prior project from the Tractatus and we are free from analytic philosophy altogether. So you don't really need to read anything that comes after the late Wittgenstein, with a serious face. Forget about Kripke, forget about, David Lewis, forget about Hilary Putnam, all the constructive metaphysics of the 70s, the modal revolution. I never took a single peek at that. I had no idea what the modal revolution was, let alone modal logic. As I told you, I didn't even know what formal logic really was. I mean, I took a course on logic because it was sort of, I had to, but it was not mandatory for me to know formal logic to graduate. And by the same token, right, there was this idea. I remember John Searle was a visiting scholar during one of the semesters that I was at Cornell. John Searle, of course, now has been canceled because he's apparently, one of those. But but John Searle came to Cornell, and I remember the very first day I met him. Right, so John Searle, for those of you who don't know, was a very prominent philosopher. He's based in Berkeley, philosopher of mind. He goes a long way back, charismatic guy. Anyway, but John Searle has a colleague named Hubert Dreyfus, who is largely responsible for bringing Heidegger into the English-speaking academic philosophical context. And we're going to talk about that tradition also. That's one of the things that I have modified the syllabus to include. But I remember during this first time I met John Searle, he would do this recurrent joke, and he actually repeated it. He was like, yeah, all those philosophers whose names start with an H who ruined philosophy in the 20th century, and before. I mean, he was talking about Hegel, Heidegger, and Husserl specifically, right? And maybe Habermas, I don't know. But basically, he would say philosophers whose names start with an H, don't even pay attention to those, right? And he would have this like kind of crass dismissal, like, oh yeah, continental philosophers like to worry about this or that and talk about like ontological this or that. Let me tell you how this works. I mean, it has this kind of like, let's cut the bullshit, get to work business. This is all nonsense, right? And if you want like the most like distilled version of the caricature of each of the two traditions, the continental philosopher paradigmatic exemplar would be something like a French philosopher wearing a scarf and a hat, talking in incomprehensible tongues with a cult of personality around him or her. And then the analytic philosopher would be a suit and tie, square, Noam Chomsky type, telling you to shut up and get a job, right? Those are the two like sort of like types that you're going to see. And they rank. I'm not saying there's no truth to the caricature, right? There's always some element of truth, but it's also, of course, a caricature precisely. So yeah, that's as far as exactly. Estigler is like a perfect example, right? Now, so one of the things that we're going to see, and this has already shown up in the chat, is what is the nature of the course in the sense of like, we're not just trying to understand this distinction, but we're trying to understand how these traditions communicate with each other at specific moments of, historical tension, in the inception of the quote unquote divide, and then at different moments in time. And what we're going to see is that this is going to crystallize what's really at stake here. And all these tiers of differences that we have been briefly sort of identifying, i.e. stylistic, methodological, substantive, academic, professional, if you will, and even political. It gets to that, obviously. These are going to show up and become pressing at different junctures of the course. So that's going to be interesting to see how this distinction operates at different levels. And that's one of the things that we're going to see. Now, there's this idea that part of what we are here to do is to cross the divide, right? It's part of like what everybody would like to think is a desirable ideal. But I would just put forward right now to your consideration that the idea of integrating the two traditions is not an innocent perspective by itself, because there are those who hold that no, a specialization and fragmentation is a good thing, is a desirable thing. So one of the things that I think we're going to see is that the way that you characterize the distinction and what you think is a good thing to happen to the distinction is not neutral, but it's already positioned somewhere in the spectrum between the distinction. Is the idea of traversing differences, synthesizing the traditions, overcoming the traditions, aufgehoben the distinction, if you will, right? Sublating it, a good thing? Or should we pursue the path of specialization, fragmentation, and so on and so forth? That is a big question itself, right? I remember not too long ago, me and Reza were having a slight bit of a bickering argument with each other, because one of the things that both of us do or are deeply steeped in is systematic philosophy, sort of dating back to what the modern great exemplars of the great systems of modernity were built upon, right? In the sense of something like, Hume's treatises or Kant's critiques or Hegel's, science of logic and phenomenology. These are systematic works where you try to bind everything into this kind of cohesive picture. And one of the things that both Rez and I were bickering about was, to what extent can philosophy really today, for example, live up to the idea that, for example, Hegel very much had of binding every domain of knowledge into this kind of systematic, coherent picture? Is that idea simply gone in the face of specialization, the proliferation of fields and subfields of discipline? I mean, can you imagine what it would take, for example, for something like a philosophy of nature, in the sense that Hegel wrote a philosophy of nature today, with the extraordinary proliferation of fields of research in the natural sciences, not to mention the formal sciences and so on, and with the advent of the social sciences, and with just this kind of like extraordinary proliferation of fields of study? What would that even look like? Is systematicity even possible? And so there comes a question. The reason why this is not just anecdotal, but relevant methodologically is, well, what is philosophy really good for? What can philosophy do? If philosophy's task was, or used to be, up until a certain point in history, a synthetic task, that is to say, a task of trying to think together the different bits of our world, the different disciplines, mode of thought and practice, how they all, as Sellers says, hang together, right? In the broadest sense possible. To what extent is that possible in a context in which the complexification of the world, the specialization of disciplines, and the just proliferation of the system of knowledge, or just the fields of knowledge, have become so dauntingly, vast, that it is basically impossible to expect the philosopher to be able to, weave all of this into a coherent picture? And if so, if that's the case, then isn't that we must relinquish the idea of philosophy as performing this synthetic task? By the same token, if indeed philosophy must, see face to face with the reality of specialization and the proliferation of disciplines, then to what extent does it even have a role to play anymore? Isn't it that, like even Heidegger at his most sort of like fatalistic moments accepts, maybe the role that philosophy used to play had been taken over by the new sciences that were emerging left and right, and that there is no longer really a place for philosophy anymore? So these are questions, of course, of very high philosophical nature, but they very much inform the way that these two different traditions conceive of the way that philosophy can survive. The analytic tradition, remaining close to the scientific ideal of specialization, tries to say, well, philosophy still has a role to play insofar as it remains close to the scientific method, to scientific research, and it lets go of this kind of like pomposity that it used to try to speak about everything, right? On the other hand, there are those, like for example, Alain Badiou, who say, no, actually, the job of philosophy at every point in time is to, kind of like Hegel, think its time, to raise its time to a level of thought, to think together the political, the artistic, the scientific, and that, quote unquote, stapling, suturing philosophy to one of its conditions, the scientific, is a nefarious perversion of philosophy's true nature or task, right? So as you can see, even at this like sort of high level of generality before getting into anything like terribly concrete, we can already see that the question of the way that these two traditions divide and conceive of themselves and what they're doing is also an attempt to think a response to the role that philosophy plays today and in the 20th century. How does philosophy survive? How does philosophy understand itself, its task, and its future, if it has one, in the wake of the changes that really are the changes of modernization, of modernity, right? And I think this is why this is not just a topic that, again, is circumscribed to the question of analytic and continental philosophy. It is the question of philosophy as such. How is philosophy understood more generally and more broadly? So this is also what interests me about this question, right? In a certain sense, there's something about the fate of philosophy hidden or thematized, and different answers to the question, what is philosophy? What is philosophy good for? Does it have a future? And what is our task insofar as we deal with philosophy or aspire to be philosophers? That's yours truly, right? Any questions or comments? That's the first sort of introductory arc, but then of course I'm going to get into more concrete stuff now that, and lo and behold, there's a PowerPoint. Yes. Anybody wants to say something?
Sorry, can I add something?
Of course.
Because most of you are philosophers or philosophy related, you have philosophy related expertise. I'm a medical doctor. You'd be surprised how many medical students and doctors are interested in philosophy. And the thing is, because medicine is mostly related to science and science-related discipline, biomedical science, mostly they are interested in analytic philosophy. And continental philosophy is usually, demonized as the woo-woo kind of philosophy that talks about, as Heidegger says, nothingness, that nothing is itself. How can you make sense of that? But myself, included, I was very much in the line of philosophers, thinkers who thought that, continental philosophy was mostly empty and, it had no content. But after reading Mass through Deleuze and philosophers like that, superficially, I came to understand that the distinction, the division, the bifurcation between them was mostly sort of linguistic. They use different terminology. If you just read them more, there's some kind of translatability between the two schools of thought that just the linguistic barrier could be bridged if you just talk with each other, basically.
No, that's very, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sure you don't know about this kind of, it's this kind of anecdotes that, because I'm from, I have graduated from medical school, and it will be surprising for philosophers to know that medical students and doctors are interested in philosophy.
I'm surprised whenever, I mean, I've met so many people that are interested, and something that's also very interesting, and that I should mention before getting into the introduction proper, which is I have found that talking to people in different fields, especially in the social sciences, but not just, something analogous or similar to the analytic continental divide takes place within different disciplines. In other words, for example, I have a friend who is a PhD in anthropology, and he was describing to me, I was explaining to him the seminar that we are in right now. And one of the things that he told me was, actually, it's very interesting because what you say rings very similar to some things that are happening in my field and that began to take shape in the last half of the 20th century, which is, there's those who think, for example, qualitative analysis is irreducible to quantitative methods, that there is this kind of complete, that to attempt to quantify human factors, cultural factors, to produce a quote unquote strict quantitative science of anthropology is is misguided methodologically to begin with. And there are those who think that those who overemphasize qualitative analysis are sort of hung up in some romantic pre-scientific notion of how it is that culture should be, studied, seriously by a field of, by a science precisely, right? And this division, then, this was in conversation with an anthropologist, and then a sociologist friend jumped in and says, yeah, there's exactly the same thing in my discipline. There's this kind of division, right? And then an economist friend came to me later and said, yeah, like what you say actually rings very, very similar. Yeah, so this is another thing that I think we're going to delve into. Federico's asking me a question. So Federico, I'll get to this in a second, but which is, isn't there something deeper hidden between this apparently exclusively philosophical distinction? Of course, we're going to be focused on this philosophical tussle, but isn't there is a more profound system of dispute between different conceptions of thinking that are not just the prerogative of philosophical research or philosophical methodology in the narrow sense, but in a certain sense, different conceptions of how it is that we solve problems, in a kind of very crass and open-ended way, in a sense that applies not just to philosophy as a discipline, but it's like something that applies potentially to all kinds of disciplines, right? So that's an interesting question, because if what my friends are saying is true, then it's not only that we can build these bridges, as Dilshad was mentioning, between this translatability between the two traditions, but that the division between the two traditions is something that we can build bridges of intelligibility to other disciplines in themselves, so that understanding this gap can tell us something interesting, perhaps, about the state of the disciplinary divisions that exist today and how they're practiced, perhaps, hopefully, right? Federico says, I don't know if you can mention the relation between British idealism and Russell and G. Morris and initial split traditions and methods, and how Bolzano and Frege enter the picture. Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll be getting, that is part of what we will be getting into, like, on short notice. That will actually be the topic now. I don't know when you got in to the conversation, but there's been some restructuration to the syllabus, so that will be the topic concretely next week, among some other things. So if you guys don't mind, can I start projecting the slideshow?
Daniel,
yeah, Eric, go for it. Go for it.
Because what you just said is I experienced almost the same, but especially that in the analytic tradition, at least as I experienced it, it was like you get presented a certain image of thought. That, okay, you have your basic course in logic, you have your basic course in what are typical fallacies and so on, and all you basically do in your entire life when you do philosophy is insert content into these formal schemas. Be them like what makes a good argument or a bad argument or formal logic, and that, okay, well, then this should seem to apply interdisciplinary. When this is thought, when this is how propositions hang together, then I should take this. I used to have very, very intense discussion with my logic tutor about this. Yeah, what is logic? And he said, yeah, logic is an instrument. But yeah, how does logic relate to the fucking world? Like, why is it an instrument? And what like, yeah, why it is? And that when I came with logic into my post-colonial theory class, okay, then it's post-colonial theory, but in general, any sociology class, they would look at me like, what are you talking about? Like the practice of theory in there, and even in the very, very empirical work, just they didn't practice theory in this way. And this is, and maybe the question, like, maybe we can come back to this in the over the course, that is it possible to think this divide between analytic and continental philosophy in a way that isn't already committed to one of the sides? Or is it just an unthinkable, I don't know, there there's a beautiful passage in Zizek's Incontinence of the Void where he talks about the relation between nature, culture, subject, object, that you're always already committed to like that when you talk about it's always the subjective or cultural mediation of the subject or of the object, and you never have like the distinction is actually unthinkable.
You know, Eric, I was actually thinking of you when you were the person who inspired me to think of this, you know, extrapolating Zizek's notion of parallax to think of this distinction. And actually, you'll see it come up later in like the slideshow. Like I make that point that you just made. And I think that's a very, very good observation, because I remember from the last seminar, you brought up this notion when we were explaining the distinction between the CCRU and the Cahiers, and you brought up the notion of parallax to bear on understanding this difference. I think that's an actually useful tool. I think I mentioned it earlier, but how you conceive of how this distinction is already somehow not neutral, right? It's inscribed somewhere in the spectrum. And that's an important thing to realize, because again, it sounds like, well, traversing the difference might be like a universally accepted, you know, desideratum or aim. But again, even that idea is aligned to the idea of synthetic systematization, right, and integration. So that's a very important, I think, point to draw up.
Epistemic imperialism.
Epistemic imperialism, I like that. But also to say one more thing about what you just said, which is concerning I mean, obviously one of the big topics that we're going to have to talk about, and we will from the get-go, is how it is that the debate surrounding the role of logic in philosophy determines somehow the fate of the consolidation of these two traditions. Because in a certain sense, both traditions begin through a direct identification of philosophy with a logical task, with the task of logic, or a regrounded logic. Either in the case of a regrounded new formal logic, in the case of Frege, or in the sense of a new quote-unquote transcendental logic, in the sense that Kant thinks of transcendental logic in the case of Husserl. And what we will see is that this originary inception of the role of logic in consolidating the scientific pretensions of philosophy at this point dictate the bifurcation and the history of the bifurcation. Now, what I just said might sound completely unintelligible, and I don't expect you to understand. It's just sort of a marker for something that we're going to explain in substantive detail as we move along. Okay, so do not feel disoriented. Well, feel disoriented, but it's fine. So let me project the PowerPoint for today, so we can.
Daniel, sorry to cut you off. Just a little practical question. Do you want to make a short break before getting into your PowerPoint? Or
yeah, maybe it's a good idea, because it's 12:20.
It's like 9:30. Yeah, it's 30. So we'll finish in an hour.
And we have an hour and 30, right?
We have an hour only left.
Oh, an hour. Yeah, you're right. It's 2 hours and a half. I always forget.
So 5 minutes or until 35?
Yeah, 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Can we do 5 minutes?
Yeah. Just one question for you regarding your webcam, because it's still like kind of try to focus in on your face, and sometimes I don't know if you can like disable the automatic zoom.
Yeah, no, I did this right before, but this is always a problem with my webcam apparently.
Okay. If you can't, it's not that bad, but it was just if you.
I like it. It's cinematic.
Yeah, but there's this little like cog zoom things with noise, which is maybe not ideal.
If I thought I disabled the autofocus, but yeah. Oh, here we go. Stupid. Now hopefully now it works.
Thank you very much.
All right, so 5 minutes and we're back. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Cool.
I'm going to have a drink.
see.
Daniel?
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a question? Another question?
Yes.
Regarding
Yes.
the presentation, do you like try to claim them at the end of the first
Yes,
class?
at the end, at the very end, we'll go through that.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Do you want me to let you know like 10 minutes before the end or any timing? Or?
Yes, that would be very helpful.
Okay. Perfect.
Thank you. Yes. G Neves. G for what? Gabriel. I will be uploading that to the. I mean, it is already in the class drive folder. So if you have access to that, you can have it. If you don't have access to that, just write to me an email or through Facebook if you have me there or whatever, and I can send it to you. But I will be I've updated it just one more time because there's one text will be changing, but it should be okay. All right. Let's see.
Also, I'm glad that my ideas, I think they were from my essay or were from contributions from the seminar.
Yeah, I don't remember where I got, but I thought of you. I remember I thought of you when I was thinking that. I was like, oh yeah.
Good to hear that my thoughts are worth something.
I think of you all the time, Eric.
Eric, we love you. No, it's good to have so many familiar faces and so many new ones, of course, as well. Is there a Facebook Messenger group for the seminar? Is there so far? Did we make one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one. I can add you 11 in case.
Yeah. Now there's like so many things going on at the same time. I'm just like having trouble. Are we all back? Hopefully, like, can I just get a show?
It's been 5 minutes, so.
Yeah, well, it's been 5 minutes, so yeah, we do need to start because obviously there's some stuff I want to show. So without further ado, allow me to present. Okay, give me 1 second. Share screen. I need to be enabled for screen sharing, Aladdin. I can't screen share.
Oh, okay. Wait. Maybe then I have to give you the right of moderator. You should be able to do it now.
Okay, cool. Let me see.
If you can just give it back to me just before the end of the class, but that's fine.
It works.
Good.
Cool. So you guys are seeing the slideshow?
perfectly.
Great, awesome. Okay, cool. Now I need to move the panel very briefly or else I won't be able to read. Okay, cool. So the first thing I want to say, give me a second, is how do I'm going to have to minimize this somehow. Just give me a second because the panel is covering part of the text for me. Here we go. Oh yeah, great. So the first thing that I want to say is something we've already broached upon, is that in order to understand this distinction, we can look at a variety of levels of specificity and different factors, right? Like we've already mentioned that there are historical backgrounds that we can go into, disciplinary affiliations, methodological tools, stylistic divergences, substantive theses, and professional, institutional, and political factors. All of these levels of determination are going to play a part in us trying to understand what's at stake in this difference. So the first thing, broad brush, is to perhaps try to give a very generic historical tracing to the question. But here already problems start, right? First thing we can say is that the analytic tradition is, as most of you might already know, often traced back to the advances in formal and symbolic logic, which was put forward by Gottlob Frege, Husserl, and in particular to the publication of the Begriffsschrift in 1879 and to Moore and Russell's engagement against the British Hegelian school. But you know, the tradition really begins to congeal and take shape with Russell and Moore's work, specifically with the advent of the philosophy of what was called logical atomism. In 1918, the publication of Russell's The Philosophy of Logical Atomism, alongside many of the other texts that Russell wrote at the time, as well as Moore's 1925, A Defense of Common Sense, as well as his 1939, Proof of an External World. And as again, some of you might already know, the first school that is sort of affiliated or associated with analytic philosophy is logical positivism. This is the great sort of movement that gives sort of cohesiveness to what is called analytic philosophy. But those who have started thinking about the history of analytic philosophy a little bit more ambitiously have tried to trace it to its sort of farther back to other sources, right? The British empiricist tradition with Locke, Hume, and Berkeley, of course, the pragmatism of Charles Sanders Peirce and William James, and you know, especially not only those within the analytic tradition who want to just think of their history, but for example, when you hear continental philosophers bicker about how, you know, analytic philosophy shares the kind of ahistorical crassness of, you know, British philosophy historically, they will make a reference to, yes, for example, Heidegger does this at some point in the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, that, you know, the analytic tradition are the hires of Locke and Hume in their kind of ahistorical mindfulness, right? Or mindlessness, I should say. Or the pragmatic attitude that characterizes the English-speaking world, something like that. Now, in his multi-volume work, The Analytic Tradition, which is the most comprehensive attempt to this day to think of the analytic school in a historical fashion, Scott Soames, who is an analytic philosopher in his own right, a kind of neo-Russellian, if that makes any sense to you, he synthesizes what he takes to be the milestones of the analytic tradition and the early break of the analytic tradition as follows. So here's a quote from the first volume in the Introduction to the Analytic Tradition, The Forefathers. 1, the extraordinary development of symbolic logic pioneered by Frege and Russell. 2, their groundbreaking transformation of the philosophy of mathematics. 3, the use of the concepts and methods developed in their logical mathematical investigations to lay the foundations for systematic investigations of language. 4, Russell's relentless attempts between 1905 and 1918 to use his method of logical and linguistic analysis to attack traditional problems of epistemology and metaphysics and to establish such analysis as the chief methodological tool by which philosophy advances. 5, the revolt of Moore and Russell against the systems of Kantian and Hegelian-inspired idealism that dominated British philosophy at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, as well as their resistance to the American pragmatism of their time. 6, Moore's agenda, setting meta-ethical views that framed debate in the subject for nearly half a century. And 7, Moore's vigorous common sense priorities in epistemology, the effects of which continue to influence philosophy down to the present day. So here's a kind of programmatic breakdown of what Soames identifies as the most salient breakthroughs that shaped the history of analytic philosophy since its inception. And we're going to return to a few of these, specifically the one number 5 concerning the influence of German idealism, because I think that that happens to be an important one to understand the relationship between the two traditions. Now, the Continental tradition, in turn, is even more hastily historically dated, right? Now, many take the definitive sort of starting point for the Continental tradition to be the consolidation of phenomenology and the phenomenological school, which was inaugurated by Edmund Husserl, kind of an analogy to how Frege designates the birth of the analytic tradition for many. And specifically to the publication of the logical investigations in the 1900s, where, and we'll talk more about this next week, of course, in that work, Husserl is overtly trying to distance himself from the kind of psychologism that had become prominent in certain offshoots of the neo-Kantian recoil against Hegel in the 19th century. And this, of course, this phenomenological project, which again, as I mentioned earlier, was still conceived very much in the horizon of a logical investigation, as the title suggests, although we will have to understand more closely what logic means for Husserl. That I just ask of you to have more patience, because that will be the topic of debate also next week. But of course, this eventually leads to the development of the phenomenological project with Ricoeur, Heidegger, and others, where the very scientific notion of transcendental philosophy begins to be amplified from its sort of early Husserlian inception and away from its sort of Kantian mode, and progressively reaches a kind of historical dimension that was before missing. Now, this is, roughly sometimes considered to be the birth of continental philosophy, but others trace the distinction to much earlier. Robert Solomon studied continental philosophy since the 1750s, which is a kind of important work, I suppose. I don't like it very much as far as history goes, but he traces the roots of the continental tradition to the modern Enlightenment and Romanticism, and he defines a series of phenomena that encompass this period that are directly correlated with the birth of continental philosophy. The rise of historicism with Hegel and others, of course, the hermeneutic school of Schleiermacher, the Sturm und Drang movement, and of course, in particular, the works of Nietzsche, Rousseau's proto-revolutionary thoughts, the late Kant and Schiller's aestheticism, Bergson's vitalism. These are just some of the sort of developments since the 17th and 18th century that shaped the becoming of continental philosophy, the consolidation of continental philosophy. So even if the tradition is, again, sort of primarily associated with the birth of phenomenology and Husserl, and the continuation of, in a way, of the neo-Kantian recoil against Hegelianism, the irony is that what would kind of define the continental tradition as we understand it today eventually is a kind of reawakening of the historical dimension that precisely is often credited to Hegel and to the Romantic period. In other words, even if it is Husserl that marks the sort of pivotal beginning point of the continental tradition, and Husserl's project was still within the horizon of a kind of Kantian transcendental project, it would be really with Heidegger's sort of amplification, applying of this project into a historical horizon, that the continental tradition would begin to see its manifold manifestations across what we understand it to be today. So things as vast as, for example, Heidegger's, of course, history of being, the historicist hermeneutic tradition that follows with Gadamer, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, existentialism with Sartre, of course, and others, deconstruction, genealogy of power with Foucault, post-structuralism, even Habermas, who's a kind of hybrid figure. All of these quote unquote traditions, schools, modes of philosophy that we associate paradigmatically with the essence of continental philosophy follow from this kind of historicist turn that can be roughly dated to Heidegger, but of course can be dated to Heidegger insofar as Heidegger rekindles certain aspects of Hegel and Nietzsche, of course, during the 30s, after his engagement with the phenomenological tradition in the 20s, within the horizon of what Husserl conceived. And we're going to talk about this in more detail when we get to that. Some even go further and try to trace the origins of the distinction to the distinction between and the identity of continental philosophy as somehow having to do precisely with the thinking of history and time, as opposed to analytic philosophy being sort of more concerned with an ahistorical perspective. And they trace this back to the distinction between Heraclitus and Parmenides, where of course continental philosophy would come to side with Heraclitus and analytic philosophy with Parmenides. And here's a quote by John Macomber, who also teaches at UCLA and who wrote a history of continental thought called Time and Becoming, which we will read briefly for next week, the introduction to this book, which is of dubious quality, but it's one of the most sort of systematic attempts. Here's a quote: "If continental philosophy holds that everything must be understood in terms of its development, then this must hold for most of all for continental philosophy itself. A brutally brief presentation would begin with Heraclitus, who was somewhat younger than Parmenides and the main ancient ancestor of continental philosophy. Just what he thought about anything is hard to say, for his writings share with those of his descendants the feature of looking extremely weird. The ancients call him ho escotenus, the obscure one. He was long believed to hold a doctrine of cosmic flux, that is, the view that all things change. Certainly, he did not clearly articulate the atemporal truth claims characteristic of traditional philosophy." And needless to say, what here Macomber calls traditional philosophy would be the sort of tradition, Parmenidean tradition, of which analytic philosophy would become the higher. Okay, so first point after these two, like sort of brief historical sort of background identifications, which is that both traditions very clearly begin to take shape in the wake of various reactions to German idealism, right? So in the case of the analytic tradition, as Scott Soames says, it's the recoil against British Hegelianism, paradigmatically the work of Bradley, for example, with Russell and Moore, and the recoil against the psychologistic tendencies of neo-Kantianism, which was, of course, already a recoil against Hegel. So even though both traditions seem to take Hegel as their proximate sort of target, in another sense, it's already a recoil against Kant as well. There is a kind of anti-Kantianism at work. So here's another quote by John Macomber, and then we're going to see a quote by Robert Brandom, which is kind of important here. So here's the Macomber quote: "Immanuel Kant took up the challenge of Hume's skepticism and met it with Hume's own weapon. He extended Hume's account of the principles which are permanent, irresistible, and universal from the imagination to the entire structure of the human mind. Kant's philosophy is thus, as we shall see, not as radically critical as many people think it is. It is really a last-ditch attempt to salvage a domain of timeless truth as the basis for philosophical thought by locating such truth within the human mind. But eventually Kant arrived at the same old question of how the atemporal order, conceived as a necessary creation of the human mind, is related to the temporal order within which we must live and act. He wrote the Critique of Judgment to answer this question. We shall see that, like his predecessor, he failed utterly. With that failure, the atemporal order could not be found either within the human mind or outside it, and the only way forward was to deny it altogether." So here Macomber, of course, is saying that really it was the failure of Kant's like final sort of campaign to conquer this thing he calls here atemporal truth, which eventually gives birth to the kind of historical thinking characteristic of continental philosophy, and which of course leads naturally to the thinking of the Romantics, not just Schiller, but of course the German idealist saga with Fichte, Schelling, and specifically Hegel, who plays a primary role for Macomber. And here's the quote by Brandom, which similarly tries to locate the kind of recoil against German idealism as the source of the analytic tradition. Quote, finding ourselves as we do in the midst of a golden age of analytic readings of Kant, initiated by Strawson and Bennett on the theoretical side and Rawls on the practical, contemporary analytic philosophers should not be understood as bound by the propagandistic insistence that all things have been made new in analysis that was put forward by some of the founding members as an integral part of the fighting faith afterward. That 207 is just just ignore it. They crafted as a crucial weapon in the struggle to make disciplinary room for their nascent movement. On one point, however, they might be proven to have been prescient. Recoiling from the particular form of Hegelianism developed by their British absolute idealist teachers, Russell and Moore advocated a particularly radical surgical intervention to prevent the spread of the infection to which they themselves had earlier fallen prey. They took it that the idealist rot had set in already with Kant, who accordingly must be excised along with Hegel from the expressively progressive tradition they were retrospectively reconstructing. Hence Russell's Zurück nach Leibniz's campaign. They were confident that one could not open the door far enough to let Kant slip through and then close it quickly enough to keep Hegel out. So that there was this kind of, long story short, what he's saying is that Russell and Moore did not only want to sort of shut down the door to Hegel specifically, but they thought if you let Kant in, then you arrive at Hegel immediately. So German idealism, since its Kantian inception, must be done away with. Let me just take a very quick look at the chat just in case there's something that needs to be addressed. Okay, no, it seems just coming.
Then one question.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
How would you say does the history, maybe, I know it's a very broad question, does the history of Marxist thought fit into this? Because we have analytic Marxism, we have the history of Marxism from Hegel onwards, we have analytical Marxism, we have very continentally, even Heideggerian inspired Marxism, we have this realization of philosophy of praxis thing, and then we have Marxism only as economy.
Right.
And maybe also with then historical and dialectical materialism in the Soviet Union, which is like these scientific, at least, aims or standards they set themselves, although they didn't really adhere to. And
Right. Well, so Marxism doesn't really play much of a role in the early consolidation of the analytic school, but it clearly does shape the self-conception and many of the strands that would be associated with continental philosophy early on, even if, of course, neither Heidegger nor Husserl were particularly friendly to Marxism. But nevertheless, now retrospectively, when we try to sort of think of the history or the series of schools that are associated with, for example, continental philosophy, it seems to be inextricable from its essence. It hasn't been the same to think of the integrity of analytic philosophy, even though, as you mentioned, there is such a thing as a sort of attempt to address Marx or to be Marxist through the tools of analytic philosophy. But that tradition actually is woefully underexplored and not very well understood, I would say, or its influence. In general, my impression, and this is not something I've actually been able to figure out completely, but my impression is that even when so developed, in other words, when Marxism finds its way into the analytic sort of programs in schools, it tends to be sort of suppressed or repressed as part of the overt curriculum. In other words, it's not something, it's something, political affiliation is not something that you wear as a badge very, very, very prominently, unless you're just a liberal progressive or something like that, or as in the case of like of Rawls or something like that. But Marxism is much more finicky. So even those professors that I have known right now that have sort of Marxist affinities in analytic philosophy programs, it doesn't really manifest itself in their pedagogical practice or in their academic labor. It's sort of kept tidily apart. And this might have to do with deeper political inflections that regulate the academic sort of structure of power, and which might need further interrogation. So we might actually get a chance to explore this in more detail as we move on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, let me go forward a little bit. So here's another series, right? So we just like briefly. So first couple of points just to rehearse. There's no tidy historiographical or historical tracing back. These can be more hastily defined depending on how far you want to go. So there's no tidy dates that we can, sort of like give for the birth of anything like this, partially because the distinction itself is not something that, of course, was a deliberate attempt. Like neither Husserl nor Russell or Moore took themselves to be inaugurating a philosophical tradition. So, what we call continental and analytic philosophy is really a retrospective gaze on the historical development of philosophy since the late 19th century, early 20th century, but looking also at the proximate and more distant influences, historical influences that shaped how these traditions came into being, looking all the way back to Parmenides, Heraclitus, and so on. So, with that being said, in this kind of retrospective gaze that first gives us a sense of where we stand here, there's also no widely accepted definition of how to identify what analytic or continental philosophy are, or how to distinguish between the two. So some, for example, have suggested that the distinction is at best a stylistic distinction, which tracks roughly a difference in how the academy is organized, right? And it's not substantive or even methodological, really. In other words, that there's not like a method, which is the proper to analytic philosophy or to continental philosophy, but that it does mark a dividing line within the academy, and of course, a difference in style, in the sense of how one writes. And this is the position that, for example, Brian Leiter, I don't know if it's Leiter or Leiter, I never actually knew this, but if you don't know this person who is a first grade moron, to be honest, and this is not a value judgment, it's just a sort of an objective report on his intellectual prowess, but he ran this blog called The Philosophy Gourmet, the Philosopher Gourmet, I've already forgotten, but it's down, where he used to rank philosophy programs and write, about philosophy as an academic discipline and an institutional, thing. And he got caught into, and people would reference Leiter's rankings very, very directly. He unfortunately came to exert a very strong influence in the academy, not of any intellectual merit of his own, because he doesn't really do any, research worth highlighting, really. But a huge controversy erupted surrounding Leiter's blogosphere informal rankings, because it was said to be heavily analytic biased. And so this rekindled a series of debates and interventions within the academy, mostly coming from English-speaking philosophers in the American and English worlds that took issue with Leiter's reconstructions and address of the analytic and continental divide. So I'm just going to rehearse a few of these points because I think they touch on some of the aspects that are relevant to us. Here's a fragment from Leiter's post from 2012 in which he tries to sort of thematize the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. Analytic philosophers, crudely speaking, aim for argumentative clarity and precision, draw freely on the tools of logic, and often identify professionally and intellectually more closely with the sciences and mathematics than with the humanities. Continental philosophy, by its relation to a series of authors from the philosophical tradition. Continental philosophy by its relation to a series of authors from the philosophical tradition. He concludes, that is Leiter, quote, Continental philosophy is more aptly characterized as a series of partly overlapping traditions in philosophy, some of whose figures have almost nothing in common with each other, with others, sorry. This is partially true, of course. Like there are sufficient robust differences between, I don't know, Derrida and Habermas, or between, you know, Gadamer and, or, you know, I don't know, Husserl and Adorno to say that, you know, well, almost to say it's almost nothing in common with each other is obviously overstating it. But there are substantive differences, right? That really do not give any kind of coherence to continental philosophy as a substantive sort of idea. But of course, Leiter here is touching upon something important, I think, which is that if you can tell me who you hang out with, I can sort of figure out the kind of person you are, right? So what Leiter is suggesting is that departmental affiliations and disciplinary affiliations, professional affiliations, determine in a way what distinguishes stylistically between the two traditions. So analytic philosophy remained historically quite close since its inception to development in the formal and natural sciences, right? As well as departments of law and in linguistics, and to their mode of production. As you probably know, analytic philosophy mostly functions through the journal article publication and is very much centered on a kind of like championing of specialization. It's welcome. Continental philosophy has been often aligned to the humanities, the social sciences, and the arts. And it has privileged grand narratives concerning the destiny of philosophy, its historical unfolding across different epochs. And it also has been defined by being a fierce critic to the ideals of Enlightenment rationality and Enlightenment thinking, the metaphysical tradition that begins really with Greek philosophy and foundationalist epistemology. So here, of course, you get a kind of very, very basic characterization of the difference between the two, which is if analytic philosophy somehow remained in the path of the sciences, right, to the ideal of philosophy aligning itself to scientific specialization, rigor, and sort of its methodological scrutinies, the continental philosophy was much more engaged with a kind of protracted historical negotiation with the tradition, including an interrogation of what science is and the idea of scientific rationality itself. So that is something that there is much truth to, and which of course Leiter is touching upon briefly. But many have disputed that this is a good enough sort of characterization of the difference. So in response to Leiter's piece, William Blattner, who works on Heidegger from a continental perspective, he's one of these quote unquote American analytic Heideggerians, if you want to call him that. He responded to Leiter in a slightly hostile piece, but in an attempt to basically shoot down everything that Leiter was saying. And he was saying basically that every factor that Leiter associated as a kind of dividing line could be shot down by counterexamples. So for example, when you say analytic philosophy is rooted in formal logic or draws heavily from logic, but of course, as we mentioned, Husserl also did. Whitehead certainly also did. And Whitehead is mostly read in continental philosophy schools, and he's been appropriated mostly by continental philosophical traditions. Continentals are closer to the humanities, whereas analytics are closer to the sciences. Well, what about the moral analytic philosophers, right? Like Scott Soames says, one of the inaugural gestures was Moore's sort of like rekindling of moral philosophy that will actually shape the history of moral. And Russell himself wrote many texts on morals and Christianity and politics and so on. And conversely, to say continental philosophy is not, concerned with the sciences, well, certainly Husserl was very much concerned with the question of science, right? He was a philosopher of science. What about people like Bachelard, right? What about Bergson and so on? To say that they weren't concerned with science would be, of course, a gross simplification, right? Analytic philosophy aims at clarity, whereas continental philosophy is very obscure. Is Sellers clear? I rest my case, right? That's all I need to say, right? that should be all you need to know. Just read Sellers and with a straight face tell me that's clear writing, and I will instruct Aladdin to kick you from the seminar. So here's a quote by Bladner. This is actually online. You can look at it. Just Google it and you'll find it. Unfortunately, the latter piece was taken down because his blog was taken down. But anyway, is there no distinction between continental and analytic philosophy at all? To claim that the distinction is entirely an illusion would be obtuse. The distinction seems rather to be based on historical sociological divisions within the profession. Let me offer some incomplete, but I hope not uninformative comments on the history of the continental analytic divide in 20th century philosophy. I do not pretend that these comments convey anything like a complete picture. For one thing, they do not really explain the relative positions within the discipline of American pragmatism and Marxism critical theory, neither of which really comfortably fit into a world divided between continental and analytic philosophy. So the reason why I included that last part is precisely to address Eric's point, which is there are these sticky points, like for example, the history of Marxism, in which it is not clear on which side of the fence they would fall, if any at all. Of course, Marxism itself conceives itself as scientific, but then again, so did Hegel, right? And I think that by and large, they would have been appropriated by the continental tradition, but again, it's not a clear-cut distinction. Give me a second. Now, Bladner goes on to rehearse a few historical and political developments that led to this, what he calls sociological and professional division. Of course, some of which we have already talked about: the recoil against British Hegelianism, the birth of the new logic, and also the political sort of turmoil that emerged with Heidegger, his affiliation with the Nazi Party, of course, and then the recoil against Heideggerianism. So here's the quote. First, some of the seminal figures in early analytic philosophy, such as Bertrand Russell, were reacting against the idealist thinkers regnant in Britain in the late 19th century, such as Bradley and Green, whose thought was in turn derivative of Hegel's. Interestingly, in the USA, the reaction against idealism also produced pragmatism, as with James and Dewey. So this is interesting because before we read in Soom's reconstruction that it was actually partially, in Brandam's quote, that also was American pragmatism that was considered to be somehow naughty, right? But here we're seeing that actually pragmatism was also largely a reaction against idealism, right? Even though with James and Dewey, you have like Hegel be a primary influence, there was a kind of overt attempt to naturalize Hegel. Kind of like the neo-Kantians attempted to a large extent to naturalize Kant. Second, in his 1929 inaugural lecture, What is Metaphysics?, Heidegger urged that we break, quote, the dominion of logic in philosophy and turn his philosophical energies in a new direction, reminiscent more of 19th century romanticism than Husserl or Kant. Heidegger had reasons and arguments for his thesis about logic. He did not just reject logic in the name of an unbridled irrationalism, and this is the most important fragment here. The so-called continental analytic division within philosophy is not a philosophical distinction, it is a sociological one. It is the product of historical accident. It is unreasonable to cleave to it, and the insistence in remaining close to work that is either presumptively analytic or presumptively continental is irrational and unphilosophical. Further, rejecting or refusing to consider positions one has not studied and consequently does not understand is not a philosophical stance. It is, if anything, the very antithesis of the philosophical attitude. In light of this conclusion, I prefer to the extent possible not to use the terms continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. They perpetuate the divisions of the past, divisions that it behooves us to overcome. And then, of course, you know what I did immediately following reading this piece is, well, put your money where your mouth is, Bladner. Let's see what your syllabi look like. Let's see what you're teaching and what your departments are teaching. Since you believe that there is no such division and you avoid it, well, let's see what you're teaching. And of course, guess what? It's Heidegger, Gadamer, Husserl, and of course, a bunch of analytic philosophers as well, and a bunch of secondary literature borrowed from the analytic school, right? What about Deleuze? What about Lacan? What about Badiou? Oh yeah, that's not part of our curriculum. What about Zizek? That's not serious. He makes jokes about poo-poo and toilets, right? No. So it's very easy to underplay the distinction. Even like Bladner is saying, okay, we shouldn't, completely ignore it, but it's just sociological. And then you look at a syllabus and you go, well, so much for underplaying it, right? So much for not being like overburdened by this distinction. So at the other end, so of course, I just given you examples of some analytic philosophers trying to tell the story. So what about continental philosophers canonically trying to address this distinction? Well, here's where things get really interesting, right? Because of course, on the side of continental philosophy, the pronunciations are far more dramatic in a way. In other words, coming from the continental fence, looking at the distinction, it no longer seems to be merely stylistic or sociological, but it acquires a kind of deep methodological and substantive difference. In fact, you often hear coming from the continental end of the spectrum, something like the claim that the entire destiny of philosophy or even humanity hinges on something like what is embedded in the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. So just to give the two most paradigmatic examples, for example, Gadamer claims, in line with Heidegger's diagnosis, that the dominion of logic is not just the seat of analytic philosophy, but it is a kind of reductionist conception of human thinking that is the accomplice, the historical accomplice of the reduction of humanity to a mechanistic thinking, which of course is ahistorical, stagnant, and profoundly the symptom of a modernity run amok, right? Everybody that knows slightly about, for example, Heidegger's misgivings concerning technology since the 50s specifically knows that Heidegger was extremely ambivalent about modernity as a process, right? On the one hand, you have something like Kant's reawakening, proto-reawakening of the ontological question, and you have Nietzsche, of course, but then you have this kind of derail of mechanization of the human, which reduces thinking to science, and science does not think. And Gadamer, very much in tune with this, believes that, the emphasis on logic that certain traditions, the analytic tradition, of course, place emphasis on, is symptomatic of a wider historical decay that is not just the derail of modernity as such, but can be traced to its metaphysical origins, to the metaphysical origins of the West, in fact, to the Greeks, to the Greek metaphysical beginning. And we'll talk about this when we get to this point. But it is something that actually here you can hear Gadamer say for himself in a way.
Intellektualisierung der modernen Sprachen im Grunde eine Verarmung ihrer Möglichkeiten darstellt. Gewiss hat die moderne wissenschaftliche Logik eine solche ganz intellektuierte Sprache einen eindeutigen Kalkül zu ihrem letzten Ziel. Und man begreift, warum. Denn Eindeutigkeit der Bezeichnung schließt in der Tat Missverständnis aus. Indessen ist die Frage, ob das die einzige Funktion der Sprache ist.
So, of course, what he's suggesting here at the end is that the emphasis with logic and the emphasis with clarity, unambiguity, an unambiguous sort of clarification of meaning, which of course is coeval with the analytic conception of semantic analysis, right? To get clear on what concepts mean, right? Is for Gadamer perhaps a misconstrual of how language functions. In other words, that ambiguity and that lack of clarity might be essential to understand language, and that therefore this reduction of philosophy to logic in fact gets something profoundly wrong, not just about philosophy, but about thinking and about meaning and about language in general. Of course, language being the vehicle through which we think. And so the idea becomes, of course, that for Gadamer, again in tune with Heidegger, that perhaps this kind of overemphasis on a scientific and logical sort of approach to linguistic analysis, philosophy, perhaps occludes other dimensions like the poetic, right, or the historical, and that these dimensions are actually crucial to overcome dogmatism and to overcome the shackles of tradition and so on and so forth, right? Now, coming out of this kind of crass introduction to how these two traditions characterize each other and themselves, right, and the difference between the two, what's interesting is that, of course, the divergences between the two schools is reflected in how they characterize the divergence, right? So Bladner and Leiter are trying to find academic and programmatic factors for the division, while someone like Heidegger, Gadamer, or Deleuze think that the division is part of a grand historical predicament, right? It's part of like where the history of the world is leading us. We need to actually grab this distinction by the reins, or else where are we going to end up, right? Now, it's important to understand then that the distinctions between stylistic, sociological, methodological, substantive determinations is kind of an escalating series of importance, right? You begin by saying, like Leiter does, it's simply stylistic. Then you scale it up a little notch and you say, okay, it's sociological. So there's a professional institutional division that makes this. And then you get into deeper waters and you say, well, no, it's actually a methodological and substantive division. It is a different conception of thinking. It is not just a professional dividing line. It is actually a different conception of what thinking is. And at the very limit, of course, you get this kind of grand historical fate that is assigned to this distinction. It is not just substantive. It is not just different conceptions, but these different conceptions determine what the fate of humanity is at the end of the day. So this is why I was saying, and I think, again, I credit Eric for helping me arrive to this sort of realization, was that the way you construct the difference itself is itself inscribed within a position. It's not neutral. The pretenses of trying to characterize the distinction with a morsel of neutrality is precisely a naivete. And hopefully this brief sort of introductory sort of exposition to how the different thinkers introduce the two, right, each other, should indicate the heavy emphasis and bias of each, right? So here's a quote from Zizek from The Tickling Object, where he draws out this distinction. I mean, not between analytic and continental, but about how it is that a distinction is always inscribed between one of the two sides. In other words, the two versions of whatever you want to call, right, are not consecutive. They should be read structurally, synchronously, like two maps of the same village, in the example from Levi-Strauss, developed in detail later. In short, what we encounter here is the function of parallax at its purest. The gap between the two versions is irreducible. It is the truth of both of them, the traumatic core around which they circulate. There is no way to resolve the tension, to find a proper solution. What first appears as a merely formal narrative deadlock, how in what order to tell the story, thus signals a more radical deadlock that pertains to the social content itself. So the narrative inflection of how you tell the story is going to determine, is already colored by your provenance and your affiliations and your agreements. Of course, the catch is, well, then Zizek's own pronunciations here have to be assessed by with the same scrutiny, right? So, this can very easily spiral out of control into a kind of like, regress of this saying that there's no meta theoretical perspective that would enable us to gain traction on the distinction neutrally. For even the claim that there is no neutral perspective is already a theoretical perspective. So you get into this deadlock. Yes, Eric.
Because this is basically like what, since like 1 year or half a year, I have been like running into this deadlock every time, that it is really the only thing one can do is show that this deadlock exists, but not think it in a propositional manner. And
Right.
then the question is, okay, is this showing a proper form of thinking or of cognition? And but it's very nice to see that someone else can formulate this also so good, and that seems to be so central to philosophy itself. Yeah.
Right. That's exactly what struck me as well, which is how, you tapping into this deadlock is not just an accidental sort of happenstance of your own, say, research or interest. It's something that invariably, if you are, reading sort of the two traditions and you're trying to think about philosophy as a whole, it's an obstacle, right? It's an obstacle that you keep getting yourself into, because the moment you try to narrativize a meta-theoretical perspective, you realize that there's no way without that this meta-narrative perspective, of meta-theoretical perspective, is somehow colored already or somehow biased in one way or the other. So if so, does this mean that, all we can ever hope for is perhaps not a clarification of the distinction, as an analytic philosopher would want to, but simply a series of competing meta-narratives, each of which are equally valid in some way? I mean, that is, in other words, the very methodological questions concerning the division and the self-conception of philosophy cannot be abstracted from how we construe the division itself. So that is, of course, part of the problem, right, in trying to address this question. It's a philosophical test in and of itself. So we have to get into logistical issues, but there's one more line of thought that I want to develop, just so please bear with me with just a little bit here, which is another level to tackle this distinction on the first instance. Is to try to understand what is at core designated by analytic and continental semantically, right? So at the purely surface level, what does analysis mean and what does continental mean, right? So analysis seems to be an operational definition, right? Analytic philosophy is defined by analysis, something that it does, by a method of analysis. But what is the opposite of analysis, right? What is the natural opposite of analysis? It's certainly not continental, right? Not semantically in any intuitive sense. Similarly, what is the opposite to continental? Continental is a geographical denomination, right? So what would be the opposite of continental? Non-European? So that is, of course, very coarse-grained, because analytic philosophy is also largely practiced in Europe, and many of its original founding fathers, like Carnap and Frege, are European. So that can't be what really is at stake here. That much is clear. Now, what about the analysis question? What is a natural opposite of analysis? And a natural thought is synthesis, right? In the sense of binding together. Now, and this is very interesting to me, because if we think of Kant, for example, this distinction between analysis and synthesis is very much intrinsic to the task of systematic philosophy, right? Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, distinguishes between the functions of the understanding, the faculty of the understanding, and the job or the faculty of reason. Reason is what binds together, while as the understanding is the faculty of dissection, of piecing apart, of separation. And reason is, on the contrary, what helps you think these different separated elements together integrally. It's the faculty of integration, of synthesis, reason. Hegel actually synthesizes this distinction between the understanding and reason in a very interesting way. This is from the Encyclopedia Logic. The activity of Fischer, Scheidens, forgive me for my shit German, which I don't speak, is the force and work, Kraft und Arbeit, of the understanding, the most astonishing, or rather, the absolute power, Macht. And here's another quote. Philosophy as a totality of knowledge produced by reflection becomes a system, that is, an organic whole of concepts, whose highest law is not the intellect, but reason. The intellect has to exhibit correctly the opposites of what it has posited, as well as its bounds, ground, and condition. Reason, on the other hand, unites these contradictories, posits both together, and suspends them both. So if one wants to say that analytic philosophy is on the side of academic specialization, if one folds this back to this German idealism question, right? and its recoil against Hegelianism, you can say in a way that perhaps analytic philosophy is defined by the passion for the understanding, right? The passion for division and separation, proliferation of different fields, specialization, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, again, in continuity with the kind of ambitions of systematic modern philosophy, paradigmatically associated with Kant and Hegel, and later, of course, with Heidegger and so on, there is in the continental tradition something like a passion for synthesis. The idea of weaving these grand narratives, of piecing together the different morsels of our history into a grandiose narrative that takes us from the Greeks into today, or which attempts to think the continuity between the political, the scientific, the artistic, the amorous, as in, for example, Badiou, right? Something like that. But this would entail that, of course, as we mentioned before, the idea of integrating analytic and continental philosophy as an end goal might be complicit with a continental bias, right? If continental philosophy has been historically sort of a passion for synthesis, then isn't it that us looking, Ressa and Aristani saying that we should just overlook the distinction, traverse it, isn't that already a continental aspiration in itself, right? Because here's the flip side of this, and this is the last thing I'll say. I know I'm going to leave the last 5 minutes for the logistics right now, but here is the flip side of the idea that we should actually strive towards integration and overcoming the distinction. Scott Soames, again, who writes the history of analytic philosophy, right? History of analytic thought, applauds a specialization and says that it's going nowhere. And in fact, philosophy should embrace it as its telos. So here it comes. Here's the last quote. This last tendency in analytic philosophy, the acceptance of small-scale philosophical investigations, grew more pronounced in the second half of the century than it was in the first. To a certain somewhat more limited extent, a similar trend can be observed in 20th century Western philosophy in general, no matter what the approach. That's not exactly true, but whatever. Much of this has to do with the institutionalization of the profession, the enormous growth in the number of people employed teaching and writing philosophy, the expansion of the audience for philosophy, and the explosion in outlets for publication. All of this has led to a degree of specialization very much like that found in other contemporary disciplines. The result, and not just in analytic philosophy, is that the field has gotten too big, too specialized, and too diverse to be encompassed by a single mind. We have gotten used to thinking of other disciplines in this way. As unsettling as it might at first seem, we will have to get used to thinking of philosophy in this way too. The careful, specialized investigations that have come in recent years to characterize much of analytical philosophy are here to stay, right? So we should embrace this as a sign of maturity. Obviously, like there was a couple more things that that I wanted to say, but of course we're out of time, and I don't want to abuse your courtesy. So what we have to do now, obviously, we're not going to go through the entire syllabus right now. So I'll leave that to your own reading because I'm not going to get into that right now. But what we do need to figure out provisionally is a kind of a schedule for presentations, which is, I know, hard to do without having a discussion on the syllabus right off the bat. So what I propose, and I don't know if Aladdin, if this is amenable, what I'll do is because I have a latest version of the syllabus with the readings and a description of the course that matches this new version of the syllabus. And what we can do is I can upload it right now. And what we can do is have people send me an email saying what they would like to present, and we can start to organize this on that basis.
Yeah, I think we can do that. Maybe ideally we should pick someone presenter and respond for next week in order
That's the thing that I
to.
was going to say. So like, can we just agree for next week? So let me just pull up the syllabus right now and project it very quickly so you can see.
Yep.
Give me a second. So you can see what's exactly at play for next week, okay? And by the way, I'll go through those last two slides from that I didn't get to starting next time, okay? Can you see the syllabus?
Yep.
Yep. All right, cool. So session 2 is the origins of the bifurcation, and this is the list of readings. So there's it seems like a lot, but they're very short texts in general. So and incidentally, so what I expect from the presentation is not necessarily a summary of all the readings. You can focus on one or on another, or you can sort of try to weave the readings into something of your own interest and accord. Really, you have intellectual freedom to pursue this in whatever way you want. They should be no more than 10 or 15 minutes tops, please. That, and I ask of courtesy to keep to timelines of 15 minutes tops, okay? And the texts, they are all already uploaded. Edmund Husserl and Frege, the correspondences, that's already in the classroom. A Defense of Common Sense by G. Moore, which is an inaugural text, which again was quoted by Soames. 2 very small entries from Bertrand Russell, Idealism, The Limits of Philosophical Knowledge, which are part of his book, The Problems of Philosophy. Then there is the introduction to the Scott Soames History of Analytic Philosophy that I mentioned, which is the Analytic Tradition, volume 1, that's also uploaded already. And finally, the introduction to Time and Philosophy by John Macomber, which is the history of continental thought. So basically, you know, the correspondence between Husserl and Frege, G. Moore, Russell, Soames, and Macomber. It's not very difficult, this material, nor is it too long. Any volunteers that wants to address?
Why people think, maybe can you give me back the moderation, right? Or you want to keep the syllabus on?
Excuse me?
Do you want to keep the syllabus, sharing your screen, or can you maybe give me the moderation so I can maybe stop the recording, because I guess that's anyway, no.
Do I have to relinquish
Yeah,
something?
you have to click next to my, there's like those 3 dots, and it should.
Oh, make host, there we go.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go. Done.
Thank you very much. So I stop the recording now, and we can decide who will present. Thank you very much, Daniel.
No, thanks to you. So Kian just volunteered to present for session 4, which is fine. To make sure that you're looking at the right version of the syllabus. Can't do next week. It's my birthday. Okay. Oh, are you gonna be here, Kian?
Nice gift. No.
Who just said? Ridges, I think, just said session.
I sent you in. Oh, sorry.
Oh, Ekin, and okay.
Yeah, I sent you an email. I don't know if you want us to sign up by email, whatever's easier for you.
I mean, both work.
Okay, I think there's probably Regis and I mean,
you can both do 7. I don't care.
Yeah, we'll figure out a way to split it up. We've done presentations together before, like one bouncing off the other, so maybe we can like coordinate it.
Me as well.
Yeah, for me that's okay.
Yeah, that works for me as well.
I can. Yeah, sorry, I can do next week. I don't know very much about either of these texts, but sort of I can sort of.
Well, that's better actually.
Yeah.
You want to do something that you're not familiar with.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
Carl. So
Thanks,
awesome.
Carl. And someone wants to respond to Carl?
Does anybody want to respond to Carl? And responses, please keep it to 5.
Yeah, it's just a really short
Situations where
file.
responses going for far too long. Does anybody want to respond to Carl? I'm. By the way, is this like a mandatory format, like the response thing?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, it is. But it's never been really clear what it exactly means. I think it's just about reading text carefully and trying to thought some other thoughts that wouldn't be direct, or like that would can raise question about the main presentation.
Sure. So does anybody want to give a response to Carl on this stuff? Shouldn't be very hard. Come on. Or I'll do.
I can do it. Otherwise, I will do it.
You'll do it.
Yeah.
Right,
if just Carl, you can communicate me what you're going to present on. Or
Yeah, sure. Probably some sort of synoptic thing of the text. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Don't worry about it. Honestly, like Jesus Christ.
No, it's.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? We're gonna. I'm sorry. I mean, we obviously ran out of time, but I'm gonna go through like starting next week at the very outset, what I'll do is go through the syllabus very quickly and just cover those last 2 slides, and then we'll get right to business. Okay, if that's okay. I'm sorry for the time constraint, but we had a lot to cover, obviously.
One last question, just shortly, because that was also a topic in the CCAU and Cahiers seminar, the problem of correlationism.
Yes.
That may if you we can come back to this during the seminar, but in which sense this problem and the different answers may hang together with the analytic and the continental tradition.
That is something.
Yeah, my initial thought would be that, okay, every position that is strong correlationism, that accepts something as unthinkable, slides somehow down the and as still important, at least slides down the continental slide.
So I mean that's got to be an actual topic we're going to get to specifically at the end in the last week. But I do think there's correlationism in both traditions. I mean, a paradigmatic strong correlationist is Wittgenstein, for example, right? So that's also a thing to talk about. But nobody needs to worry about that right now. I mean, that's farther down the line, and that's of course part of terminology that many might not be familiar with right now. But we will be talking about that. Anything else that anybody wants to ask, or anything that anybody needs? All right, so I'll be uploading the updated syllabus right now. It's basically the same as the one that's already there, except that there's a change in the Heidegger text. We're going to be reading what is metaphysics as opposed to basic problems of philosophy, just because I think it's a little bit more focused to our topic and shorter as well. So yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks for everybody.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry, where would you upload the documents? I'm not familiar with.
Oh, so there should be there's a Google Drive folder. So if you log into the classroom for the class.
Oh, okay.
So there should be a folder with all the readings and also with the syllabus.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
In case,
yeah, thank you.
In case you have problem accessing, you can ask me and I can send it to you.
Okay.
Just
thank
let
you.
me know.
Cool. All right, so I guess we're golden.
Yep. Have a nice
Have a good
day
weekend.
and see you soon.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Daniel. Bye.
Hernan, we will. I'll call you through Messenger. Okay?
Perfect.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.